Welcome back to another video, and this one's gonna be a quick one, but it's going over a topic that I've kind of wanted to discuss for a bit now, and that is why I'm not a fan of the cueing of pre-hinging on the squat. And frankly, I used to be. It used to be something that I very often used as a tool, and nowadays more often, I really bias away from it. I can't think of a single lifter I coach who I actually currently recommend it for. And I decided to make this video after I actually did a more full-scale video about the top 5 ways to manage your center of mass that will be coming out on Powerlifting Now later this year, maybe even early next year. But just a small snippet of that was me talking about why I find that the pre-hinge cueing or setup on squat tends to lead to more issues than not for most people. So before going any further, what is pre-hinging? Just in case you're not familiar with this thought process and what I'm talking about in that initial starting position. So all of this I'm going to be discussing today is very much specific to the low bar squat as well, because that's very important to understand. When I would also apply this to high bar or safety bar and would likely say the same things, but this is very much applied to low bar. So in our low bar setup, just naturally, especially if I had more weight on the bar, we're going to have a slight forward lean. Reason being is because of that low bar position, we cannot stand directly upright. If we did, especially with more weight, that bar is going to fall right off of our back. So based on where that low bar position is, we're going to have a slight lean. You might have the French low bar, and they're going to have a lot more forward lean, which is getting to the things I've somewhat ranted on with IPF and USAPL rules in regards to standing erect. Or if you're high bar, you likely can stand straight up and sit down, since that bar is going to be on a flat surface versus when it's on our rear delts. We're going to have to slightly lean forward to clear that platform. With that being said, the pre-hinge is when we take that to the next degree and have a little bit more of a forward torso lean, and actually starting with more of a lean to begin with. So why do people pre-hinge? I've got kind of 4 reasons here. 2 for the reasons that I think are mistakes and are getting people in trouble, and the other 2 for reasons that likely are going to be the best option for someone, and in the minority of what I think is most powerlifters. So the 2 reasons that I find to be mistakes is the first one, this is myself included, and why I used to cue this and have some people do it, is to help people get out of an extension bias and have a more natural lean. What I mean by that is we commonly see someone trying to remain too upright in a squat. They get in that rib cage flare, they anteriorly rotate their pelvis, and while that's not always incorrect to do, it definitely gets a lot of people into trouble. And so a lot of times when we're trying to cue the thought of drive the knees forward and let the chest lean, having a little bit more of a pre-hinge just kind of lets that natural lean happen, because that chest is just going to want to drop when it's already pre-hinge. Natural gravity of that bar is making it want to continue to hinge. The issue with that, as we're going to get to, is I find way too many lifters use this as a band-aid to fix an issue, aka the extension bias, that could very well be fixed from other aspects, and likely the pre-hinge is just going to create just as many issues as the extension bias in the first place. The second reason I see people pre-hinging out of mistake and not out of necessity is actually inadvertent, and it comes down to foot pressure. When we are more heel heavy bias, we are going to naturally have more of a forward lean. If we're more forefoot bias, we're going to naturally be more upright. So when someone gets very, very heel bias and too far back onto their heels, you're going to find that inadvertently they start to pre-hinge a bit more. And so that actually is a root cause of the foot pressure, but they kind of link hand in hand. The other 2 reasons people might pre-hinge are actually could be of benefit, but again, I think it's a small minority. The one reason could be someone who is going to bias more into their posterior chain and more of that hip extension aspect as they leverage that to be stronger. I mean, an example might be, you might see someone squat like this, they pre-hinge, they squat down, their hips shoot back up, and they complete the squat. And while it may not look like a perfect squat, for them, based on their mechanics and their musculature and where they are the strongest, that leverages their strongest positions. That could be for them, but I do not think that's for most people. The second reason is more common one, is based off of leverages, your stance width, or your bar position. Leverages meaning maybe you have really long femurs and a short torso, so you're going to go through a lot of range of motion with that torso lean to be able to squat, so you kind of want to get a little bit of a head start, considering you're going to have to lean a good amount as you descend in the movement. The second one is a wider stance. You're going to have less bias towards forward knee movement. You're going to have more of a forward lean a lot of times. So you might bias into a little bit of a forward lean, a la like a David Wilson. And the last one is bar position, which I already alluded to. If you're in that very, very, very low bar position, you have no choice but to lean so that bar can actually stay on your back, as well as by being in that low bar, that like French low bar position, you're already deciding you're going to bias into more of a torso lean and hip extension based movement versus being into as much knee flexion. So moving forward, why am I not a fan of the pre-hinge setup? And we're going to go through 5 different reasons why I think that for a lot of lifters, it gets them into more trouble than it actually helps. So getting into the first point, it tends to cause notable center of mass issues with a good deal of lifters, especially the ones that are doing it out of a band-aid versus out of a necessity. And what I mean by that is when we have a pre-hinge position, an exaggerated torso lean, we're getting a head start here. No matter what we do in a squat, no matter what your leverages are, or how you squat, stance with all that kind of stuff, you're going through some degrees of torso lean, hip flexion, and knee flexion. And there's movement that has to happen. And from a low bar position, I already showed that naturally it already biases to giving us a head start in regards to that torso lean. So when we add to that, for a lot of people, there's nowhere to go other than the knees have to travel forward. And even with that, they may already be starting past the limit of where they get. Because if I'm starting right here, I actually am not going to end up there to get to depth. I'm going to end up here. So I'm actually biasing to more torso lean than I even need. And what's likely going to happen with a lot of people is they're going to bias in that excessive torso lean. They're going to get down right here. I'm hitting my end range of hip flexion. I have nowhere to go for more range of motion to my hips. So the only thing that I can do is then likely shift forward, get more forward knee drive, and it's going to likely shift my center of mass forward because that rear bias is going to pull me forward to self-correct. So what we very often see with someone who biases into this pre-hinge pattern is they look really good, and then at the bottom they forward shift, their hips shoot back to compensate. You'll literally see a lot of times their toes are going to come up and they're going to rock back onto their heels. Then they shift back forward, regain their center of mass, and then lock out the movement. And taking that and getting into the second point, we even add to that, and I've already alluded to, is when we're in this pre-hinge bias, we're going to likely leverage back into our heel. It's pretty hard not to. The only way we're going to be able to not leverage too far back into our heel is likely to have our knees bent a little bit. And that takes me from being very heel heavy to being a bit more of my midfoot. But guess what? I can't get a start command now in powerlifting. My knees have to be locked. So because of that, I'm starting in a rear heel bias. And so as I go to descend, I'm going to shift forward into my forefoot. So not only am I possibly running out of room for hip flexion, dependent on the lifter, I'm on a heel bias starting position, and that's going to shift me towards my toes at the bottom, again, creating a center of mass issue. And then point number 3 continues to build off of this, because like I said, if we're biasing into that pre-hinge, we're getting a head start in regards to hip flexion and that torso lean. And we're gonna have to make up that room with our knee flexion and that forward knee drive because it's gonna have to get to a certain point. We can't stay here and stay back because I can't hit depth. At a certain point, based on someone's leverages and how they're squatting, something's gonna have to move forward to allow that hip crease to get below the knee and to manage your center of mass appropriately in some way, because we can't stay back on our heel, because if we do, we're just gonna fall backwards. So if we're doing the pre-hinge and we're keeping our knees locked, look what happens. It's going to pull my femurs and my shins back with it, especially if we're doing a fairly exaggerated motion of it. I'm going into that negative shin angle. My knees are now almost going behind, not behind my heel, but it's going from over my midfoot and stacked to basically over my heel and behind my midfoot. And so now there's even more distance from here to here. I'm now making up more distance. That knee is going to have to travel forward to get to where it needs to be at the bottom of the squat. And way too often what I see is someone's in this position, they try to evenly break at the knees and the hips, as you likely should. If we're here, we want to evenly break at the knees and the hips, as I've mentioned in other videos. But if we're already pre-hinge, that even break is not even. It's literally just getting my knees to be stacked back over my midfoot. And then from this point, I have nowhere to go other than my knees going forward. If I'm not cueing that, I'm going to get into those issues of center of mass like I mentioned. Going into point number 4 is where I said a lot of times this is a band-aid that causes more issues than not. And it's a lot of times a band-aid to fix an extension bias, but it ends up just ending up in an extension bias. And what I mean by that is we get into this pre-hinge, and like I said, if my knees aren't getting forward, I'm gonna have to do something to get my center of mass forward. So often what you see is someone's in this pre-hinge position, they're gonna have their knees go forward and their hips are gonna break. Really, I'm still heel biased, so what's gonna have to happen is I'm going to have to rotate my rib cage to counterbalance that position, to get my forward of mass to counterbalance where those hips are and the rest of my body, and just lead back into that extension bias and not fix anything in the first place. And to kind of go along with the last 2 points of the foot pressure and also the extension bias it can create, a lot of times people are using this as a band-aid because they feel like they're more stacked when they're in that pre-hinge due to an issue from the get-go. Is if someone's already decently back on their heels and they try and stay upright, like they're gonna try and stay upright. I literally can't stay on my heels doing that. As soon as you want to get a bit more upright, it's going to shift you in your midfoot, which is what you likely should be doing. So if you're going to continue to stay on your heels, to be in this position, you're likely going to have to extend to counterbalance. And so it's hard to brace and you don't feel stacked per se. So what happens is the lifter will pre-hinge so they can maintain that heel bias. Now they feel a bit more stacked when the issue from the first place was nothing going on with the torso. It was just foot pressure. And if I would have just gotten a bit more over that midfoot, a bit more forefoot pressure, that would have fixed the bracing mechanic issue that I was experiencing in the first place. And then the last thing, and point number 5, is I find that people that do this tend to get into trouble in rep work, because what we see is we see a continued increase of the pre-hinge bias as things go along, and we see a decrease in the consistency and center of mass control as the reps go along. And so what they'll do is, like, maybe the first couple reps will look good. They won't be excessively pre-hinged, but they'll be a little bit pre-hinged, a little bit heel heavy bias. But as they go through and as they start coming through that movement, they consistently contain that or maintain that heel heavy bias, get more pre-hinge, and then the latter reps start to get even more forward shift bias, and we get to more of that kind of stripper squat and hip shoot and sway back and forth as we go through those reps. So if I'm recommending that most people should not pre-hinge, barring the precursors I mentioned based off of leverages, stance width, and bar position, and some other factors there, what should you do instead to fix the issues you're likely trying to band-aid with that pre-hinge in the first place? So the 3 things I would probably look to address first, and what I think are likely the actual issues to begin with, is 1, foot pressure, 2, head position, or 3, bracing mechanics. So I already dived a lot into foot pressure and what happens when we get a bit heel bias. So I'm not going to overly go into that. I've explained very much in that heel bias to forefoot bias and getting over that midfoot of how that's going to affect things. So simply, if you're consistently wanting to bias into a pre-hinge and maybe inadvertently, we got to fix that foot pressure, which could come from a multitude of factors, whether it's some type of change with foot pressure, maybe it's a shoe change, anything that's going to get you to leverage that slight forefoot pressure a bit better so you can be over that midfoot. The next fix is head position. And honestly, for a lot of people that are doing this purposefully to get out of an extension bias, I find that the head position is actually the root cause. And what I'm gonna get at is a lot of times they're in this position, they don't look too bad, but they're kind of looking straight forward and up, which you can see, and since my neck and my chin are not following in line with my torso, which is usually my general prescription for most people, is as a baseline, is to keep the head and neck in line with that rib cage and upper back, with it's the natural degree you want, versus biasing to extension or biasing in the flexion. But that's a whole discussion in itself. But what happens too often is someone's like, okay, I'm in my low bar position. Every single time I squat, I'm wanting to stay too upright and flare my rib cage. It's likely where the head is leading. And they're then, rather than changing that head position, they're gonna bias that pre-hinge. And then what happens? The exact same thing, because the head is going to lead that rib cage and that thorax where it's pointed to. So for a lot of people, we can use that natural lean on low bar. It's already there. And rather than looking directly straight forward, likely just looking down about 5 to 10 feet in front of you on the floor is going to fix any issue with someone naturally letting that chest need to lean and not having to get that through a band-aid of that pre-hinge position. And then the last fix would just be bracing mechanics in general. I'm not gonna go over that in detail because I've got a whole video on low bar setup and bracing, and I'll link that below in the description box. But just general bracing mechanics and not knowing how to manage that rib cage position and that interior core pressure, and being too much into an extension bias and not using that belt properly. So again, watch that video if you want more on bracing. But the 3 main things I'd be looking to address first before I'm gonna start maybe cueing the pre-hinge to band-aid something is gonna be looking at foot pressure, looking at that head position, and then looking at bracing mechanics. So to summarize, those are the reasons why I am not a fan of the pre-hinge starting position setup that I see some people using. For many powerlifters, it's going to lead to those 5 issues I mentioned when it comes to center of mass, foot pressure, that initial shin position, the extension bias, and also that rep work consistency. And like I said, I think it would be better to address things through other things such as head position, foot pressure, and or bracing mechanics, or just in general squat cueing, which I've made videos on that as well, of just general ideas of how I'm gonna be able to teach the squat. I think that's gonna be a better fix long-term than using that pre-hinge position to kind of band-aid it. Again, there are some people that it works really well for, and I mentioned the kind of portion of powerlifters that I think can bias towards that pattern, but for most, I think it's kind of tends to be overused and uses the band-aid and just results in more issues than it's even fixing. So if you have any questions, make sure to comment in the comment section. Be happy to answer those. But until next time, peace.